All right, well, again, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Hill. I'm the marketing manager at Meyers Nave, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar on Senate Bill 743 that requires the analysis of transportation impacts under CEQA to be based on vehicle miles traveled instead of level of service. A few things to get us started for this webinar today. To eliminate background noise, the audio for all of our attendees has been muted. You will be able to hear the presenters as soon as they start, but no one will be able to hear you. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them using the Q&A button located in the black bar on the top or bottom of your screen. Our presenters will do their best to answer all your questions during or at the conclusion of the webinar. There's also a chat function in this room as well, so if you experience any audio issues, slides not advancing, that sort of thing, go ahead and use that chat function, and myself and Justin, also joining us from Meyers Nave today, will help you on the administrative side of IT issues and fun webinar rooms. We are offering MCLE credit today. Those certificates will be emailed at the conclusion of either this webinar or by the end of this week. We emailed a copy of the PowerPoint to everyone this morning so you can advance the slides on your own in case we encounter technology issues. Tim and Shaye will reference the slide number. So far, so good, but you never know what happens due to the work from home world we are all living in today. Again, today's presenters are Tim and Shaye. Thank you guys for being here. Tim practices in all areas of land use and environmental law. His specialty is guiding development projects through the maze of land use and environmental regulations on the local, state, and federal levels. And Shaye has more than 18 years of experience with complex issues involving land use and zoning, as well as natural resources and environmental law compliance and litigation. Tim and Shaye have worked together on all types of projects throughout the state of California. Thank you guys so much. I am going to close out my video and leave the floor to you.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Tim Cremin, and Shaye was with us today. So a couple of quick notes. One is acknowledging that we're still like 2 months into the shelter in place, so I hope everyone is doing well and their families and loved ones are also doing well. We're going to hope the technology gods are kind to us this morning, and we get through this without any glitches, but thank you all for joining. Next slide. So the first thing we want to talk about is that CEQA now requires VMT analysis starting on July 1st of this year. So that's coming up, and there's been a bit of a scramble recently of how to deal with this and how to get ready for this transition to VMT. Since it's going to be VMT under CEQA, that means that level of service is no longer an impact under CEQA. There have been a lot of questions about what standards apply to VMT analysis. There's a couple of sources of those standards, and those listed in the slide.
Okay. Well, as Tim mentioned, again, this is going to be a new requirement starting July 1st, 2020. And it's, quite a shift. That level of service is no longer going to be considered an impact under CEQA. And what standards are going to be applied, and we're going to look at, that either follow the state OPR guidance, there's Council of Governments guidance, public agency adopted standards, and case-by-case options. And we're going to be talking about all of these in the course of our presentation. As a reminder, I mean, the OPR guidance is extremely helpful. It's a recommendation, but you're not required to actually follow it. And so, you can also see what other, like the neighboring jurisdictions are doing in that. And so, but we're going to be covering all these issues today about as kind of we said, this is the new way. Should we move on to slide 3? So, what is VMT? It's vehicle miles traveled, obviously, and this it's where you're going to calculate the miles that are in the private automobile, the vehicle, that a project would generate, and it's to and from and every kind of trip in between. And as a general concept, it's calculated on a per capita based on a service population, and it can be you know, and then you can also calculate it, you know, for certain projects per employee, or you know, or other type, or depending upon your project. And really what the today, you know, there's a ton of technical issues involved with this, and it's, you know, in terms of just, you know, what's included in a trip, you know, the different methodologies and models and assumptions used. And we're not going to cover all of those today. This is really just meant to introduce the concept and what is going to be needed to be done for your CEQA documents. But just to remind that there's a lot of, that the guidelines do say that that this is up to a local discretion, and that certain jurisdictions will have different issues in terms of how to calculate this. But what I want to say is that the main point is that it's really a change in the focus of, you know, from LOS is how a project would affect driving, but will change to the amount of driving actually caused by a project. And so that's what we're really looking at and what VMT is going to calculate. But let's move on to slide number 4. Wait and see, please. So one thing to remember also is that though this is definitely a huge change with respect to how CEQA documents are prepared, that level of service is not gone. It just is now a non-CEQA issue. And it may still need to be required and to be analyzed in other contexts. And for example, we know that a lot of general plan policies include LLS as, you know, a requirement, as, you know, for making projects have to meet a certain LLS level. And to be clear, that just because you know, the OPR, the new guidelines have been adopted, it doesn't mean that jurisdictions have to go out and amend their general plans that are based on LLS. That there's no requirement to amend those. That's really a policy decision for those jurisdictions, and that they, you know, they may continue to play a role in particular planning. But I would say something to keep in mind is that if you're in a jurisdiction where your general plan has a LOS policy, you may want to consider, something to consider is, how is that going to kind of mesh with this new requirement of VMT in the CEQA documents? For example, if you have a project that the general plan is requiring an LOS analysis, but CEQA is now requiring VMT, if you're going to have to make a decision of how to analyze or include the LOS still in your process, and whether or not that should even go in the CEQA document. And so in a lot of ways, even though this is not a requirement to amend the general plans, there may be that this might be a trigger for considering whether or not updating general plans, or the next general plan update of updating these plans and policies to possibly phase out the reliance on LOS, or maybe explain why it would be needed for certain reasons. To just that it might make a more streamlined, easier CEQA process, but also kind of bring policies in line with the new policy direction of the state, and in the idea that LOS is a bit of an outmoded concept. To go on to slide number 5. Actually, this is a good time to talk about this. Is why are we moving to vehicle miles traveled to VMT? And this is primarily driven as a reduction in response to need to reduce GHG emissions. And so the concept of VMT has already been kind of baked into a lot of those measures that were already being used to address needing to meet GHG targets for different projects and communities. It's also looking at the transportation as a multimodal kind of system rather than just vehicles. And it allows for the transportation analysis in CEQA documents to better capture the full impacts of individual automobile use. That, you know, again, as we mentioned, the GHG emissions, AQ, the public health impacts, rather than just the impacts on traffic congestion and driving conditions, which is what would LLS really captures. And it really allows the analysis under CEQA to be more aligned with the state goals under SB 743 and the sustainable community strategies for reducing the GHG emissions. And it also promotes land use development control and urban infill, transit-oriented, and mixed-use development. And what's interesting about it is that a lot of often a lot of goals and objectives for VMT, a lot of the you know, targets for VMT can actually be achieved through you know, that type of planning. That it's actually, you know, putting in the thought process into land use patterns and urban smart growth and infill can really reduce down VMT, and that's like baking that whole concept all into that. So it creates, you know, it's really designed to be a regional approach to a regional problem that as a community, as a region, to really bring down the dependence on the individual automobile.
Right. And one thing I'll add, can you hear me now, Shaye?
Yes.
Okay, one thing I will add is that, you know, unlike traditional traffic analysis, which looks at congestion and traffic operation issues, really VMT has this land use overlay to it, which is how different land uses interact, how residential interacts with office and residential with retail. And so one of the interesting parts, although we're in the transportation world, it is actually a pretty significant land use world for this type of analysis. So that's one thing that's much different, and we'll talk about that more later.
Absolutely, it really does kind of mesh the fields of, you know, we talked about GHG, but now, you know, the GHG and transportation have always been related, but it actually brings in the land use controls as well. Let's move on to 6. So this is just to kind of explain what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to look at some methods of screening for VMT impacts and when a full-fledged VMT analysis would not be required. We're going to talk about thresholds of significance for VMT and how they might be adopted based on land use and project type. We're going to talk about the process for the local adoption of VMT thresholds, the mitigation options for mitigating such impacts. And for each category, we're going to really talk about the issues and challenges for each topic. And kind of bake it right in. So we do ask, like, if you have questions during it, feel free to just, you know, do the Q&A and do it, and we'll try to see what we can do in terms of addressing some of your questions as we move along.
Right, and I will just note that we do see some questions are coming in, so to the extent we can do them while we're doing the presentation, we will.
Great. So moving on, so to 7. So what do we mean by screening? This is like when the VMT analysis would not be required. And I was going to talk about 3 different areas. You know, that there's some general CEQA principles that really apply to any project or impact area, and it's not really necessarily unique to VMT. We're going to talk about some VMT-specific screening mechanisms. And we're also going to talk about some important streamlining kind of mechanisms, which don't necessarily, you know, say you don't have to consider, but it moves right along.
And one thing I'll say about screening, which is important, is that one of the concerns is that VMT is going to require CEQA analysis and CEQA documents when otherwise they would not be required for other aspects of the project. So this is important to focus on screening, because what it's saying is that in certain situations, and we'll go through them, the analysis is not required and does not trigger the need to do a CEQA document for a project. So this is an important concept for this new CEQA impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really the point of a lot of the OPR guidance, is that, you know, VMT is not meant to be the driver. So let's move on to slide 8. So so just some general rules for screening out is that there's certain things that are, that just as a reminder that the ordinary CEQA rules still apply in terms of like if you have a decision that's not discretionary, it's simply ministerial, that CEQA doesn't apply at all. You do not have to be concerned about these VMT analysis for projects that are exempt from CEQA, that are just as usual. So it wouldn't take a project out of an exemption. I also wanted a reminder that projects that have already been analyzed in a prior EIR, program or specific plan EIR, that VMT wouldn't take them out of that either. It's just the typical whether or not a supplemental review would be required because of a changed circumstance or new information. Has already been it has been held by the courts that we do not see that the adoption of VMT as being the new method for analyzing transportation impacts to be new information or changed circumstances. And this was already addressed like for when there was new analysis provided for GHG, and that was the courts have held that that is not considered new information or changed circumstances, and the same would be applied here. VMT is not meant to be a reopener. It's really just another way of analyzing the same impacts for a project. So if a project was analyzed in a prior document, the adoption of these new VMT requirements does not mean that that EIR needs to be reopened. And finally, we wanted that discretionary approvals that do not have any transportation issues, such as design review, you wouldn't really have VMT as being an issue. And finally, and we're going to talk a little bit later about this later on, but that if you have standard conditions or approvals that require a VMT already, that you can really kind of bake in at the beginning of a project that a project is going to meet the thresholds without having to do any just as by its nature, without actually doing a full-fledged VMT analysis. We move on to slide 9. So, but OPR has provided some specific things for kind of screening out mechanisms for VMT in particular. And and it has made suggestions on how a detailed analysis can be avoided in certain cases. For example, that projects within a half-mile of a major transit stop or in a transit priority area, the guidelines say now that it's presumed that to have a low VMT, it would not, go over the threshold. And that actually overlaps with some pre-existing CEQA exemptions. So you could possibly even just fall under a CEQA exemption for one of those the transit priority areas or a half-mile from a major transit stop. But again, OPR has kind of doubled down on that concept because it's really that by siting projects there, you're going to minimize the reliance on private vehicles, and you're going to minimize the vehicle miles traveled, so that there is a presumption that it's going to have a very low VMT. And the same for affordable housing projects. OPR has talked about that because a lot of them are cited again with transit-oriented development, and that there's a presumption that these also would fall under, would not actually hit any threshold. So projects located within a VMT generating traffic analysis zone. So these are the other area that OPR has talked about is that these maps that are designed by land use, by residential and office, showing existing VMT for certain areas. And the concept is that because new development in such areas would likely result in the same level of VMT, such maps can be used to screen out residential and office projects from needing to prepare a detailed analysis. And And so you basically just, and we're going to take a look at a map in a second, but you have your project and it falls within a certain zone. There's a presumption that the VMT is at a certain level and therefore would screen out the need to do a detailed analysis. And finally, OPR has suggested that some projects that based on project size and type are presumed to have a very low level of daily trips, and therefore can be screened out. And this would be the idea that they're presumed to have fewer than 110 trips per day. Now, again, these assumptions, that if there's substantial evidence in the record that would indicate that that assumption isn't true, that the project would generate a significantly more higher level of VMT, then those just wouldn't apply. And so here, let's move on to slide 10. And so that's just an example of the map that if your project would fall in one of those areas, you can see the ones where they would meet the threshold or be under, and then the city average, areas that could be mitigated and ones that could not. And you could definitely have these maps and be able to screen out projects in this way. Let's move on to slide 11, and I think, Tim, you're going to talk a little bit about thresholds.
Yes, I am. So local discussion versus OPI guidance versus Council of Governments guidance. Basically, the issue here is localities are concerned if they're bound by what OPR is saying or what their Council of Local Governments is saying in their guidance. The answer is no. Even though those are used as recommendations and guidance, they are not required criteria for localities or other public agencies to adopt. So local agencies have discretion. They can consider local conditions, and that they need to apply the general standards that apply for CEQA threshold adoption, which are in guideline section 15064.7. And those are that the threshold should be adopted from based on substantial evidence after public review.
Talk about general principles of thresholds. Again, you can adopt, as Tim already said, you can adopt you have local discretion to adopt your own thresholds to consider local conditions. That the typical CEQA threshold standard still applies. That if you're going to adopt a threshold, it just must be supported by substantial evidence. Let's move on to slide number slide 12. VMT thresholds, general principles. That in general, we look at it being that by land use type, the OPR has said that the general threshold is a 50% below average standard. And so that's usually the threshold that we're kind of looking at. As we did say, though, it is up to the individual lead agency's discretion, and that that if it's supported by substantial evidence, that 50% is not written in stone, but it does seem to be the prevailing standard. But I mean, the reason why to think about these concepts are that we look at that every region is going to be different, because you do have a choice of region and city for the average. So when we say 50% below average, that the choice is up to the jurisdiction in determining what that average is. You definitely have housing rich areas compared to jobs rich areas, and to add in also that a threshold for general plan or sustainable community strategies consistency as well. That's really the challenge is that if your plans are still in LOS category, try to say about consistency maybe wouldn't have as much information, but that would be kind of the idea of moving the plans forward to try to address VMT overall as a region-wide solution. So we'll move on to slide 13. So VMT thresholds for residential. OPR recommendation, as we mentioned before, is 15% below average. The existing VMT per capita. Again, it's up to the discretion of the agency on whether what to use for that the per capita. The city or the region for the existing VMT and what to use as your kind of baseline for the reduction. As mentioned earlier, a lot of VMT objectives can be achieved just through smart growth general plan kind of policies and citing residential and work kind of together and through transit-oriented development policy. Moving on to to slide 14. Offices. Similar, its OPR recommendation is 15% below existing VMT per employee. This existing can be measured by the region, or what the existing VMT is by the region, or where most workers live, so it could be smaller. So that's an actual, we're talking about general thresholds, but that's an interesting concept about, for certain projects, the average VMT, if all the workers are living in certain areas, that might be something to keep in mind. So, and in terms of, what kind of smart growth, solutions can be, kind of baked in is really, is putting more residential near offices. Is that the kind of growth solution to bringing down VMT? And so, and also then citing office projects nearer to existing residential, could that also solve some VMT problems? It's kind of interesting because the idea of whether or not you would really have like a local serving office is kind of, that's really like a project by project kind of concept, and it's harder to kind of bake that into a general threshold. Hey, Tim.
Hey, am I back on?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. I guess I jinxed myself. I'll jump back in, Shaye, if that's okay.
That
would be great. A couple of minutes break. Okay, thank you. So we're in the VMT threshold for office. I will say one thing is that the problem here with office often is for jobs-rich communities, which is how to solve and reduce your office VMT is really a function of nearby residential. And going back to the land use concept, it's hard for an office project to solve the problem of having people living nearby, which would reduce VMT for their employees. So for offices, looking at it on the regional basis is what OPR recommends, but that's often problematic because on the regional basis, if you're a job-rich city, then your VMT for your employees is going to be high. And to meet the regional average is going to be difficult for these types of uses. So that was why I think the concept of smart growth general plans or plans versus project is relevant to offices. And I will say that even though OPR says that you should measure it by region, I think there's arguments in job-rich cities that you should measure it by your city or a smaller area where most of your workers live. Next slide. So for mixed use, that's one that is a VMT favored use because it allows a mix of uses between, like let's say residential and commercial, just like I said, and that would cut down VMT because you have internal chips in mixed use. So for mixed use thresholds, even though they're favored, they're not screened out automatically. So there's two ways you can do it. One is apply the threshold to each individual use. So the residential threshold would apply to the residential uses, office to the office, retail to the retail, or apply the threshold to the predominant use, which is the one that is the majority of the mixed use. I will say that in this instance, the most important thing in mixed use development is to capture the benefits of internal trips. In other words, trips that don't need to be taken by residents or workers or shoppers because they're in the same place now. On the two thresholds, I actually think that looking at the individual uses is the best with the internal trips captured. Next slide. For retail and industrial, unlike the 15% below, for these two uses, really the standard is there a net increase in VTM in the area with or without the project? And so here, how it applies is that you choose your area, whether it's regional or a city, and then you see the change that the project causes in the VMT. And the reason for this is because retail in particular often redistributes existing trips. So people who would shop somewhere now shop somewhere differently. They're not really new trips. The real important part of retail is local versus regional serving, and this goes back to our screening discussion. For local serving retail, really a large local serving retail project could be screened out from VMT analysis because their trips are local serving, and therefore they actually reduce VMT by having people shop closer to their homes. So depending on the land uses in the jurisdiction, if there's a lot of homes and they're introducing a new retail use, that may well be a reduction in VMT that would be able to screen out the analysis for those projects. And local serving retail may be as much as 100,000 square feet. So it could be a large project. They could also use market studies to show that the local serving retail is within, their customers are within, let's say, 5 miles, which is a short trip from a VMT standpoint. Lastly and briefly, heavy industrial, it's a unique use. Be careful about the difference between light industrial and heavy industrial. You know, light industrial often can be a version of an office use now, using a warehouse for more what would be considered office type uses, where heavy industrial, we're talking old school industrial. That really is a tough project to deal with VMT because it's unique and it often doesn't want to be in an infill area. It wants to be segregated for other uses. So I don't think that's as important. Next slide. Briefly on transportation projects, this comes up and there's been questions related to it. Basically, the type of transportation project that creates an issue is one that increases roadway capacity or extends a road, so it induces travel. And that's really the issue and the type of transportation project that needs to do a VMT analysis. We referenced the guidelines section that talks about this. And also, if you look at OPI's guidelines on this issue, their rule about what needs to be covered is really swallowed by everything that's screened out. And screened out include transportation projects, transit projects, alternative transportation projects such as biking, walking, those types of improvements. So with transportation projects won't come up that often, but those are the thresholds that apply. Next slide. Okay, and I'm going to keep going on this. We have questions, so I'm going to keep going, and then Shaye will jump back in, and then we'll go to questions. This is an important issue about the adoption process. Some questions have come up about this. Let me walk through the slide and answer some of the questions. First, for your adoption, if you're a public agency and you're adopting CEQA thresholds of significance, there is a required adoption process by the guidelines. It requires a public process, so it requires public review, and it requires formal adoption through either an ordinance, a resolution, regulations, or a rule. One thing I see happening now that creates an issue is, and Shaye and I were talking about this yesterday, the need to let people know what's going on. The public outreach part of this, because transportation normally is considered, oh, that's like a traffic congestion issue, and everyone knows who deals with projects that if you're going to have local opposition, it is often because of roadway congestion. And in a CEQA context, that's been one of the leading reasons for lawsuits and objections and disputes. So here, I think the public process really needs to be an education process where you reach out to people who are going to be affected by this change in LOS to VTM, which includes public, it includes developers, it includes environmental, it includes economic interests, because it affects how land uses are developed and where they go. So I'd strongly recommend, even though we're in May, that if you haven't done an outreach and education process, do that so people understand what's going on. And as part of doing that, you'll satisfy the public review component of the CEQA requirement. Your thresholds, as we talked throughout this presentation, need to be based on substantial evidence. So make sure there's evidence in the record when you pick, for example, 15% below the local average for office. Make sure there's evidence in the record that supports why you're doing this. And one of those could be the job-rich nature of your community. And lastly, as we've talked throughout, you have discretion. Don't feel like if you don't adopt OPRs, you're getting the water or you're legally deficient. That's not true. And a question came up about whether CEQA itself is required for the adoption of the VMT thresholds and guidance. The answer is no, that the adoption of a CEQA guidance threshold or screening mechanism is not subject to CEQA. So you don't have to do like an initial study or an MND or some form of secret document for this.
Not considered a project, but as you pointed out, there's still like a detailed process for the adoption.
Correct. There's a public process that needs to be done, but it's not a formal CEQA process. And on adoption, I guess we'll go to the next slide. And Shaye and I, we can be more interactive. We have a lot of questions, so we're going to plan to end in a couple of minutes and go to questions. So I'll tee this up. On VMT reduction measures, again, go back to the theme. This is not LOS, so we're not talking about traffic signals. We're not talking about stop signs. We're not talking about signal coordination. We're not talking about roadway improvements. Really, if you've been in the transportation world a while, what we're talking about is transportation reduction measures, TDM measures, that have been around for a long time. And what they are measures that reduce trips, and they're often seen in office projects. And there is an existing menu of options that is often used for TDM programs that have associated reductions with them. And what the project needs to do is pick a menu of options for that project that will result in the reduction that's required. The other things we want to introduce on this is that also there have been a little bit of head scratching on what are effective VMT reduction measures to reduce vehicles miles traveled significantly. And that goes back to the issue of this presenting a regional issue, and really regional measures would work the best. And so we'll at least preview that the concept of mitigation banks or fees to fund regional projects that would reduce VMT overall is one of the issues that has come into play over time. And there's a paper by UC Berkeley and a paper by Fair and Peers that talks about ideas for structuring VMT mitigation banks. So look at that. Next slide. Okay, Shaye, feel free to jump in. This is talking about the different ways that VMT reductions can be dealt with. Projects can include measures as part of the project. Sometimes that's called self-mitigation, but really taking a proactive position in the formulation of your project to include measures that are going to reduce VMT will then support a finding that you have a less than significant impact for this project. And that will get you out of the need to do VMT analysis. For example, if your project includes a TDM program that will result in certain reductions of measures over time, let's say to 15%. So that's talking about sort of pre-dealing with the situation. Another way of pre-dealing with the situation, in other words, avoiding the need to do study and mitigation, is through general plan policies or programs that require certain types of reductions to be done as part of any project, as part of your land use development plan for the city. Those again can be upfront enforcement mechanisms to reduce vehicle miles traveled and reduce the need for CEQA analysis. The last concept is what we call standard conditions of approval. And what those are is a lot of jurisdictions for, let's say, grading and hydrology and geology have moved to what they call standard conditions of approval, which are permit requirements that apply to all projects that mitigate and reduce impacts. And therefore, since you have a condition for hydrology or for geology, for soil study, then you don't need to study that because it's already covered and will result in a less than significant impact. We think that same concept can be applied to VMT for having a standard condition that requires a certain trip reduction for your project. And that is another way to try to deal with this before you get into a formal CEQA document. Next and last slide before we go to questions. Okay, so Rubik's Cube. Part of this is because some people, and this is where the technical support comes in from the traffic consultants, measuring VMT reduction is a little bit trickier than doing level of service analysis. So part of this is how do you establish what is the amount of reduction that's required to result in a less than significant impact. And there's been this ongoing conversation about the relationship between just a reduction in number of trips, which is easy to sort of measure, or at least there's historic mechanisms for doing that, versus actually measuring how vehicle miles traveled are reduced. That gets a little harder. So there has been attempts to show that the reduction in number of trips is sort of a proxy for a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. And if you reduce your trips by, let's say, 10%, that there'll be a corresponding somewhat equivalent reduction in vehicle miles traveled. And Shaye, maybe some thoughts about monitoring and enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly that. I mean, I think really that, you know, these are just all the first steps, and that how actually a project achieves the 50% reduction and how the lead agency needs to monitor and enforcement is really a big question. And whether or not, you know, we do already see for large projects that, you know, you might have some sort of annual review of what is going on in terms of, you know, if all these measures have been put in place and whether or not it's actually seen an on the ground reduction in trips. But I don't know if that's actually feasible for every project that now that we're in the VMT world, and then exactly, you know, what kind of reporting is going to be required. Because though all these measures, and so we talked about, there's lots and lots of measures that can be baked in, either at the front end or as mitigation. They all should reduce, but you know, it's really, it depends on project by project kind of determination in terms of how it actually will be achieved. I don't know, Tim, do you have any further thoughts on that?
No, I think that covers it. And then I was going to try to jump in on some of the questions. Doing this live would work a lot better, but what I'm going to do is I'm scrolling through some questions, and I'm going to see ones that have been repeated here. So one goes back to the issue where we said if there's an existing EIR that applies to the project that did LOS, not VMT, should you still tear off that older EIR's LOS analysis and not do VMT? This goes back to what Shaye was talking about, which is a greenhouse gas case we both handled, which is new regulations aren't a trigger for supplemental environmental review. So the fact that the rules have changed in and of itself does not require that you do a supplement to existing EIR. I will also note, and people like argue about that, but we worked on the case and I'll stand behind that legal rule. And one other thing I'll say is that VMT has been disclosed and analyzed in prior EIRs as part of air quality or greenhouse gas analysis, so it hasn't been completely ignored. So there's a legal rule and there's a rule that often they include it. There's a question on accessory dwelling units, which are approved at administrative level. Would a VMT analysis be required? That gets back to the screening out issue and the question about discretionary versus ministerial decisions. So under CEQA, it only applies to discretionary decisions, not ministerial decisions. And a lot of accessory dwelling units and honestly a number of affordable housing new laws are trying to limit discretionary decisions. So if you don't have a discretionary decision, you don't have CEQA, you're not required to do VMT analysis. A lot of questions about my volume. Sorry about that. Hopefully it's better. Here's an interesting one. You know, maybe clarifying how screening out is different from an adopted threshold. Do you want to talk to that, Shaye, while I cover others?
Well, I would say that when we say screening, what it really is whether or not you have to do a detailed VMT analysis for the project. And it's that there are certain assumptions that OPR has put out there and some other mechanisms that we talked about with the maps, that if a project falls within these presumptions, then you're not needing to do a full-on analysis, which kind of goes back to what Tim talked about, is like that VMT is not meant to be the driver for the preparation of environmental documents. And that's really the concept of the screening. So in like, just like kind of blunt terms, it would mean that you're not going to require an EIR if you for VMT if you fall within one of these presumptions, one of these kind of screening areas. But so in a lot of ways, I mean, so it's the threshold matters because it's like a presumption that that threshold's not even going to be touched at all, you know, or reached. And that's really what we're meaning, is that you get the screen out of the full-on VMT analysis.
Right. Here's an interesting question that came up about the relationship of LOS going forward. So a lot of jurisdictions we've worked with have been like, oh, wow, now CEQA says VMT. Does that mean we no longer do LOS? The question is, from a pure CEQA standpoint, no. But from a general plan and operation standpoint, and we had one of those slides on this, like LOS continues. LOS can be required under your general plan policies It can be required under operational standards. It still can be part of your traffic impact fees. It can still result in the requirement for conditions of approval related to LOS. It's just not a secret issue. So that's important. Don't think you have to throw out LOS, period, because like we said, especially from a public standpoint, there still is, how are streets going to operate? How is the traffic going to be for me to get to work or to school? So those will continue. We're looking, oh, heavy trucks. A question came up about how heavy trucks are dealt with in VMT analysis. This came up in OPR's webinar, and the statute for VMT, which is SB 743, addresses passenger cars and light trucks. That's what is covered by it. That's what the greenhouse gas analysis is under the scoping plan. So heavy trucks are not required to be included in VMT analysis. They are certainly going to be required, let's say, for noise or air quality or other CEQA issues. But in the OPR webinar and in their materials, they were clear that it doesn't include heavy trucks.
But it doesn't mean you can't use VMT if an agency or jurisdiction chooses to for that. It's not required.
That's right. Here's a question about local serving retail being screened out. I mentioned quickly a retail market study, and the question is, how would that support a defensible screening out determination? Well, how it works is this. I think certain uses are clearly local serving retail, and they're probably defined under your zoning code. But there are also market studies that show certain types of uses attract customers from a certain radius, like a certain number of miles. And so if you have a screening out criteria that talks about local serving retail, then I would say that you could also have a screening option that says it's local serving retail of a certain size as defined under the code, or, and this is the upfront thing, the project provides a market study that shows their area of customers is 5 miles or less. I think that's defensible. It's all about evidence. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Shaye.
No, I agree. I think that it would be defensible. I mean, it's, again, baking it in. I think it actually kind of goes to a few other questions we had about the screening process for certain projects. And I do want to say that the importance is that if you have facts, if you have substantial evidence that suggests that a project really can't be screened out, like for some reason it's a particularly auto-intensive use, then the presumptions that OPR has put out and the screening options really aren't appropriate in that case. So, but I like the idea, Tim, of like you could bake something into your threshold to, you know, kind of provide that evidence that supports the screening out mechanism can be used.
Right. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat feature, which is a struggle to navigate here. But one came up about electric vehicles. I'll make a quick comment on that, which is, you know, the VMT regulations are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they're getting at it through a land use rubric. But really, electric vehicle doesn't emit greenhouse gases. I mean, if you have a clean source of electricity that's charging those vehicles. So I will just say, and this is more just commentary, like, good point. It's like if we're moving towards an electric fleet and our goal is greenhouse gas reduction, then, I mean, honestly, if it's all electric vehicle on a clean energy charge, it's not contributing to greenhouse gases. So an interesting interaction between technology, VMT, and greenhouse gas. Another question about why adoption of a policy is not subject to CEQA. There was a case about this, and I will just say that the case determined, I think correctly, that when you adopt thresholds under CEQA under a public process, there's an inherent environmental review aspect to that. And there'll also be environmental review with implemented, so that act itself is not subject to CEQA. You just need to follow the CEQA rules, again, of a public review process and formal adoption of the threshold. I'm still scrolling. We're getting close. Well, it's 1 o'clock.
A lot of questions, yes.
Yeah, and it's hard.
I'll just say really quickly, a major transit stop is generally one that has an intersection of 2 or more major bus routes and intervals of 15 minutes or less. Somebody asked.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of questions about tiering, and it's an interest, and you know, we stand by our position that the adoption of the VMT analysis is not new information or, you know, create a new impact. And as we point out, it's, you know, the background and the support for that is really the case that deal with that the adoption of GHG kind of analysis was not, it does not create a new impact because it's not a new information. However, if you are tearing off of an old document and preparing a new document, you're going through the analysis of the 2116 process already. And again, as we keep saying, this is really, we're looking for, you know, substantial evidence in the record to support your approach. And so even if you're tearing off of like a program EIR, but you're doing a lot of analysis, you know, I think it's a project by project kind of determination about whether or not you want to add the VMT analysis into that mix, because I think it really depends on whether or not there is any reason to even question whether or not the transportation analysis prior wouldn't still be valid. I mean, do you agree, Tim? I mean, I just see we have a lot of questions about this.
Yeah, and I'm going to move to just a couple of other questions that keep coming up. One, you know, if a project is exempt under CEQA, does it have to do VMT? Like, let's be clear on that one. Like, the general CEQA rules apply to VMT. So if your project's exempt from CEQA, it's exempt from CEQA VMT analysis. The other one that keeps coming up is about, you know, this thing about not having discretionary land use approvals for certain types of affordable housing. Again, the general CEQA rules apply to VMT. If it's not a discretionary decision, CEQA isn't triggered, therefore VMT is not triggered. There was a question about what do you mean by existing VMT baseline? And maybe we race through that a little quick. What it means is it's a CEQA concept that, let's say, you're comparing it to the region for housing. So there is a calculated, and normally in the SCS RTPs for a region, there is a average VMT per resident for the region. So the existing VMT would be the existing average VMT for the area, which here is the region, you know, divided by the number of residents. So it depends on the area you choose. A question came in about whether existing should be current or future. Like, should it be the most recent data we have or looking forward to a future date? It should be the most recent data you have. It may well not be 2020. It might be 2018 or 2019. Whatever the most recent data you have is the data you should use, not a future baseline situation. We're at 1:04. I guess people obviously can always drop. Shaye, why don't we keep going for a couple more minutes, because there are just a bunch of questions that are flying around here. Oh, this one follows up on my commentary on electric vehicles. Interesting question. do you include electric vehicles in VMT analysis? Yes, you do. You know, it's still a vehicle trip. Even though it's an alternative fuel vehicle, it's still a vehicle trip. And that maybe highlights the issue I was commenting on, which is if your goal is emissions reduction, there's other ways to do that besides reducing vehicle miles traveled. But right now, all vehicle trips. Give us a second. Okay, here's an interesting question. We keep saying that LOS survives from a general plan or other standpoint, but not a CEQA standpoint. And this person asks, but if it's in your general plan, don't you need to do a consistency analysis under the land use and planning section of Appendix G? So I'll jump in first, and then Shaye will correct me or contradict me. But I will say that the general plan consistency analysis in CEQA concerns policies that are to reduce environmental impacts. And people forget that, and they think it's just any general plan policy, but has to be tied to one that reduces environmental impacts. So my argument would be no for LOS, because LOS is no longer an environmental impact under CEQA. Shaye, nodding your head.
That was exactly what I was going to say. That's one of my favorite provisions. That yes, and then LOS is not addressing. I mean, that's really what's kind of clear about the movement to VMT is LOS is really traffic congestion is a social problem, right? I mean, that's really what the movement is, and that is no longer an environmental impact. Now, I mean, we did get some questions about, oh, how can we still enforce conditions and stuff that are designed to reduce LOS? You know, that's just going to be through other land use mechanisms in order to achieve that, you know, perhaps, you know, but it's not going to be through CEQA mitigation measures. You're no longer going to be able to do, you know, requiring the expansion of roads or the additions of signals and things. The conventional traffic transportation mitigation measures. It's really the menu of options now on reducing the amount of driving is the key here.
Right. Here's an interesting question on whether you can do a qualitative analysis based on factors like live, work, proximity, multimodal transit, reduced parking requirements. Should those types of features support a screening out of VMT on a qualitative basis? I will say I would lean against that, because what I think is a more defensible way of getting there is to use one of the more formal screening mechanisms, because I think what is described in this question actually would probably qualify that type of project for being screened out on one of the more formal screening mechanisms that have a quantitative underlying basis to them. So just being an attorney, which me and Shaye are, I would say, hey, if you have a more defensible way to get there, I would rely on the screening mechanism rather than qualitative. There is one part of the guidelines that says you can do qualitative if quantitative is not available, but I would apply that narrowly.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But I think those projects will
like
be
those measures, that project does probably fall under one of the pre-existing kind of screening ones with those kinds.
Yeah. Still just scrolling through questions.
Some timing questions, Tim. I mean, what about? I mean, where were they?
The timing question.
On the adoption of it.
Yeah, all right, I'll start with one thought, which is really important. I mean, everyone is racing towards this July 1st deadline where the statute says that VMT analysis is required. So this came up in OPR's webinar, and they mentioned that public agencies can proceed on a case-by-case basis if they don't have formal adopted standards at July 1st. The issue though is that come July 1st, if your document's going out for public review after that date, it is going to have some form of VMT analysis. So in the absence of adopted agency guidelines, you could do a case by case. I'm going to say that you're also going to get some pushback of why you wouldn't be using, let's say, OPR's guidance or your local council of governments guidance if you don't have your own. So I hate having people race at this point in time, but OPR says they're not moving the date, and you got to do it. So I would say case by case is an option, but you're going to have to then wrestle with OPR and your Council of Governments guidance. Shaye, thoughts?
No, I agree. That's exactly my thought.
Okay. There's a question again about the public process required if you're, quote, defaulting to OPR's thresholds. This sounds like a situation where maybe the city is not going to be able to formally adopt thresholds in time for July 1st. So I would say, rather than saying is a public process required, the public process is required for the formal adoption of VMT guidelines and thresholds. So if you're not there, then the public process doesn't apply and you're back to the case-by-case basis. So then if you choose to use OPRs, I mean, that doesn't require a public process, but certainly the case-by-case analysis is going to require a public review process because there's going to be a document associated with or a public review associated with that project. So that's how you get there, but not the formal public review for adoption thresholds that we talked about.
And Tim, I would say that if your existing thresholds, CEQA thresholds, have LOS in it, and you're not going to try to change that by the deadline, I mean, obviously you're going to have to address it on a case-by-case basis, but it's going to cause some confusion for your CEQA documents.
Yeah, that I agree with that comment. I mean, that's an issue. By the way, OPR is having office hours, virtual office hours that they sent out a email blast about over the next month for certain issues. We're approaching 1:15, and I think I see a lot of people are still on, but we got to call it at some point. So I'm going to try to give some closing thoughts. One is that we may be able to just distribute the questions. Someone asked if we could distribute the questions. If we can, we will, but I'm not sure how that works logistically. So that's one. Second, I will say that this is a complicated issue, and we didn't cover like the technical issues associated with it about methodology and models and assumptions. You know, we're attorneys. I always joke I pretend to be a traffic expert when I have to deal with it with CEQA, but I'm not, and I'll speak for Shaye and say neither is she. So I will say for all those technical questions, you have to reach out to a traffic transportation consultant. And my last thought is, you know, I think everyone needs to do the best they can at this point in time for their initial adoption. This field is going to change over time, and I think we all need to be as careful as possible for what we decide to do as our initial analysis. But I will say that as time passes, there's going to be more guidance. There's going to be court cases. There's going to be methodology information that may lead to refinements in what you're adopting. So even though public agencies should be as careful as possible in their initial adoption, it's not etched in stone forever and ever, amen. So do the best you can, but realize that there will be opportunities to adjust and amend them going forward. And based on experience you have, that may be helpful. Shaye?
No, I appreciate everyone coming out today and going, staying with us during technical difficulties. But I think we'll be talking a lot more about this topic. And this was just meant to be kind of an overview in light of the looming deadline, and that we're definitely available and to always discuss these issues more.
Yeah, certainly reach out to us. I mean, the last slide is our contact information and our email addresses. And we tried to do the best we can in a short period of time. And of course, I had my technical difficulties, which I feel bad about, but we are available to address issues that people have that they didn't get clear answers to today or have follow-up for either of us. So with that note, I guess we'll bring it to a close. Thank you again for your participation. Thank you again for your questions and trying to make it interactive in this virtual webinar.